Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this curious story that falls into that indistinct territory somewhere between the curious and the frightening. Also, we all have to start somewhere, and the support of appreciative souls like you will always take us further as we learn our skills from sentence to sentence. I would really value having your support, by you subscribing and then hitting the notification bell, so you can know when the next part is published. And let me know where you are. Write it in the comments below. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. And if you wish to learn where the two main characters come from and what the story is all about, then why not go back to the very beginning? You're back? Right. Let's get on with it. Chapter 8. The first entity sounded shocked by what he'd just heard. You would do that? I just may go and have a conversation with him, said the second entity. The other sounded amused. You would go and have a conversation with him? And willingly give away our presents? The second retaliated with, I think he's finished. The first mused on this a moment. You think he's finished, you say? Do you really think that? Well, let me know when you're going to do this. And I'll happily watch him tear you apart. During those pleasant and cool spring evenings, we both sat on the sofa with the log fire blazing and the house feeling safe and nurturing. I enjoyed reading old sci-fi novels with music on in the background. I did that purposefully to avoid wasting time watching rubbish on my phone. When it happened to catch a signal, that is. I glanced over at Shadow occasionally and noticed him staring into space. It was clear that he was very preoccupied with something. I often asked him why he was here and what was he waiting for. The evidence of our experiences so far strongly suggested that there was nothing ordinary about him. Or his reason for being here. Before Shadow, I'd never experienced the company of demented ghosts, wraiths and monsters before, and I was astounded how I'd somehow managed to take it all in my stride. I mean, it couldn't be normal, surely? There again, maybe you should expect delusional thoughts from someone like me. I reckoned I skated up and down the spectrum between futile despair and utter confusion much too quickly and far too frequently. Even so, I somehow made it through each day with a gentle momentum, seeing the important things completed. I think this was all probably to do with age. And rather than focus on dreams that no longer had a future in which they could be achieved, I focused on what I could achieve in the short and medium term. Namely the garden. Physical application and physical results. No apps or technology were involved on my side of the growing contract. Shadow came and went according to a schedule known only to him, always returning to his corner of the sofa and the dependable waiter service. A few times recently he'd returned exhausted beyond reason and slept for days before picking up again and making my life difficult, for his entertainment more than anything, I'm convinced. Nonetheless, as Jenny said, he'd been company for me and stopped me wallowing, because while wallowing might be good for a hippopotamus, it's not good for humans. At least Jenny knew nothing of my adventures, because she'd probably call the Pope. I looked at Shadow, and wondered how his account at the bookies was doing. And whether there was an outside chance I'd ever receive any pennies in rent. A recent event persuaded me that he created curious instabilities when he was in the world. Even though this will sound completely silly, and I would never mention it to Jenny, I believed Shadow could create overlaps between the present and the past. I know that sounds daft. But anyway, listen to this. Shadow had taken to traveling around the island in the car. Naturally, I did the driving. And for an animal after a fashion, he took to this with casual ease. Cats I'd taken to the vets in the past either vomited or defecated on the back seat. Some of the evidence still marked the fabric and was palpable in hot weather. Unlike all those beloved and sadly missed creatures, Shadow enjoyed himself. And was always content to lie along the back shelf staring out at the passing countryside. Maybe he was pretending he was on the bridge of a spaceship flitting between star clusters. I don't know. He liked the rural back roads most of all, the old places my dad took me to when he worked for the water board. But as with everything Shadow did, there just had to be a reason. The road from Thlinvers to Llanacamed has probably been a back road for centuries. However, if you look back to that time through the lens of family stories, you would know that these roads were once essential arteries of the island's commerce, crisscrossing our agricultural heartland. These arteries are undoubtedly thousands of years old, because they're the most obvious and probably the safest routes across the landscape for drovers and people taking goods to market. The territory above the island's center used to be known as the Badlands. This is where you ran to if you were a naughty person being chased by officers of the law. Anglesey was heavily forested for a long time, as was much of Britain. The major clearances across much of Britain were due to sheep, though it wasn't the sheep who cut down the trees, which freed the land for grazing and agriculture. On market days and Sundays, these now lonely roads would have seen many people on business, or greeting each other as they walked to and from chapel or church. They were also the byways of many tramps, primarily men who had suffered in the trenches of the First World War. They wandered from place to place seeking shelter, food, and rare kindnesses. Traveling in my father's car during school holidays, we encountered solitary length men. They were individuals employed by local councils to keep the hedgerows and ditches on these old ways in good order. My father would occasionally stop and have a chat with them. I regret bitterly not listening to their conversations, because I now know that some of these men who performed their essential tasks were also significant individuals in their communities. Importantly, I learned that we are judged by the company we keep. And so I sincerely hoped I wasn't being judged for my association with that cat. So far we'd been going out for a spin every evening for a week before I realized that Shadow was looking for something in particular. As I mentioned elsewhere, I knew almost every road and lane on our beautiful island and would vary the routes without knowing why. Still, it got me out of the house and from the arduous work in the garden. And I suppose I was grateful for that. Too much of a good thing etc. will choke someone else's dog, or something like that. Towards the end of the week, Shadow was content to sit on the top of the passenger seat after I removed the headrest. I don't know why I pandered to him like that. Anyway, we were pootling along the road from Flintfors that evening. It's a drive through gentle rolling countryside on a road with a high camber and the odd launch pad hump that kept surprising me. Shadow had become noticeably excited as we approached a particular spot on the road, and came up to what I knew was a long slow corner. He hopped off the seat rest and stood with his hind legs on the passenger seat and front paws on the dashboard. I knew to stop. Yet again the cat was issuing orders. I parked in a passing space made muddy by the large tractors that farmers allow their 17-year-old sons to drive while texting. I turned to Shadow. I was puzzled because I saw nothing there, except a decrepit old barn on our immediate left, and a ruined cottage in the middle of the field opposite. I stared at the old rickety red corrugated barn and decided it was only one good winter storm away from collapse. However, Shadow wasn't looking there, but across to the field on our right. There, in the middle of a rough meadow, stood a desperately old cottage, abandoned in sad isolation. The same rusted corrugated sheets had been nailed across the windows and door, and one of God's weeds was growing through what little remained of the poorly tiled roof. "What we doing here?" I asked him. He was standing on my lap and staring out the driver's side window. He was much heavier than he looked. Then he stared at me and issued the next order. "Open the goddamn door, idiot." I checked behind and forward for incoming traffic and opened the door as instructed. Our tiny galactic warrior hopped down and sensibly checked for traffic before bounding across the single-lane tarmac road. "Feel free to run away if you want," I shouted after him. He paid me no attention as he pushed his way through the cow parsley and hopped quickly onto the crumbling wall. I locked the door and followed him across the road, hoping we wouldn't be here too long. I turned and checked the car. It was fine there. We should be all right and in sight of any traffic from either direction. He'd wisely ignored the collapsed 5-bar wooden gate, barely held together with a rainbow of different colored baling twine. It was in too dangerous a state to open or clamber over, so I decided I'd venture over the crumbling wall, and as usual, I nearly broke my neck when a large rock hidden in the rough grass rolled away under my foot. The cat wasn't good for my health and safety, I concluded, as I finally got over into the field with all the grace and elegance of a ruptured duck. The derelict cottage reflected so much of the island's rural poverty and all the misery of a bygone age. And to be honest, I was surprised it hadn't been snapped up for a holiday home by now. These old cottages were simple small two-room affairs for living and sleeping. Like mine had once been. They were no place for old age. Even after Lloyd George's pension scheme in the 1920s, they must have been miserable in winter. This was an open area of the island with little shelter from the harsh cold and wind-driven rain. Despite the pension, life had remained appallingly harsh. Before the marvelous National Health Service was created, for want of a shilling to pay the local doctor, you could die of diseases that require little more than an antibiotic today. They were dark times when the sense of a community had to be strong because, as my great-grandmother used to say, so many people were vulnerable to falling off the bottom of the ladder and ending up in the workhouses. We'd once had 2 of those appalling institutions on the island. People died invisibly in lonely places like this. All you need do is wander around the more isolated cemeteries, and you'll find gravestones that are little more than offcuts of larger slate. So many names have been worn away, and it feels like those poor people never existed. After only a single generation, we will ourselves be forgotten. About halfway across the rugged lumpy terrain, I felt again that fear of harsh loneliness and desolation that had once terrified me before Jenny took me under her wing. I saw that the grass was thick and clumped, and hadn't been cut or regularly grazed for many years. Shadow's erect tail looked like a periscope making its way toward the tiny abode, and now and then he'd stop to make sure I was following. There was a rough low stone wall around the front of the cottage, coming out about a dozen feet from each of the gable ends of the building. I knew there would be no back door, because with such a small building, it would have only been of use to the wind. In the front, I guessed would have been a painted wooden or wrought iron gate leading into a small patch of vegetables and herbs. I wondered if there had once been colourful hydrangea bushes here somewhere. A Welsh dresser and hydrangeas were once ubiquitous to many rural Anglesey homes. Shadow suddenly appeared out of the tall grasses and stood on the wall where I could see that he was surveying the ruin intently. Why would he be drawn here of all places? Cold lonely ghosts would have been resident here far longer in death than in life. Is it the sadness of their own lives that compels them to interfere in ours, I wondered? In mine anyway. Is this the place Shadow had been looking for during our evening drives? I couldn't imagine what was here that might be of the slightest interest to him. I placed my thinking to one side because he was waiting for me. And so I quite literally tripped over to him. "What are we doing here?" I asked, knowing I'd have to work it out myself. The gate was long gone, but I could easily step over the wall into the sad remnant of a once essential garden. In keeping with my graceless climbing, I stood on another hidden round stone and fell backwards, landing on the wall on my backside. I cried out and howled in agony but received no sympathy for my apparent incompetence. Shadow switched his gaze back onto the cottage. This cat did nothing without deliberation. It could have been a plan to see me flounder, but I was doing that all the time those days. Shadow never needed to wander too far from his spot on the sofa for his entertainment. "It's just a ruined old cottage," I said. He gave me a glance to acknowledge my existence and that I'd said some words to describe the bleeding obvious, then he turned back to the cottage with the same look of deep preoccupation I'd seen increasingly of late. I found a safe place to sit. Rubbing my sore bottom, I took in the cottage, hoping to discover why we were there. "This is far too old for either of us to know about," I said. "It's been a ruin as long as I remember. It might have been occupied when my mother was a child in the 1930s. Mam came from this area. It had probably been abandoned since the early 60s, long before I could have known anything of the people who lived there. The wooden lintel above the door was damp, brown and rotten, and what I could see of the door beneath the corrugated metal said it was in much the same condition. There was still a lick of faded and flaked blue paint on parts of the window frames not covered over. Even the poorest of people had pride in those days," I said wistfully. "I wonder who lived here." I told Shadow about an equally small cottage a few miles away, where a single parent had brought up 7 children. One son had gone on to become a manager in a London bank. The other boys and girls had grown up and slipped into their community. And, according to Mam, had been decent people, mothers, fathers, labourers and tradesmen. Dad always insisted that it wasn't where you were brought up that defined you, but the values that were invested in your home. Poverty and tough times brought people together in those days. There were fewer chips on shoulders because you never knew when it would be your turn to be in difficulty. Despite a simple education and very few opportunities, people rose to be decent and significant in the lives of others in one way or another. It was a quiet and warm evening, and the daylight was extending nicely. Soon there'd be flowers for the house and salad on my plate. I was looking forward to seeing and tasting the fruits of my ongoing hard labor. The cottage was built from what people used to call rude stones and rubble, something you'd probably pay a premium for in London these days. There had to be a small quarry close by, no more than a hole in the ground probably. One that most farmers used to harvest for building walls and maybe the odd outhouse. It was all the same stone of assorted sizes held together by apathetic gravity and damp lime cement. Inside would be a compacted earth and lime floor, and once there might have been linoleum covering it as well as the odd rug. The furniture would probably have been standing on bricks against the damp. Eva Hughes and Mrs. Hughes would once have lived in the same way. As a ruin, it might have once been a store like the collapsing barn on the other side of the road. The rusting corrugated iron might have been nailed in place to keep out thieves, but there would have been little worth stealing in this poor agricultural land. More likely, it was to keep out sheep and cows. There may be money to be made in farming these days, but not then. Not in fields as small and unkempt as the one in which we were standing. Or sitting rather. Shadow hadn't moved. And I could see his eyes glistening as he gazed attentively at the ruin. Was he being wistful? I wouldn't have expected that of him. But this little cottage was somehow important. Why? Maybe it had to do with the secret life he lived every time he disappeared. We stayed like that for what must have been an hour according to the gathering twilight and growing shadows. I regretted not bringing my jacket, but no one had told me we were coming here, or that we'd be away from the car for that long. Shadow occasionally turned and stared intently across the field. And thankfully the crows that had been croaking noisily since we arrived were finally settling down in their nests, and other than the odd complaint or wishing each other good night, they were slowly falling silent. Shadow continued to send out his sight across the field, as if he were waiting for something or someone. It must have been important because we were way past his supper time. A fox on 40-a-day ciggies coughed in one of the fields beyond. We continued to wait there in nature's hiatus between day and night. My bottom was numb on the cold stones, and my lower back had begun to stiffen. "I've got to walk about," I said, and rotated over the wall on my cold bottom and went for a slow trundle, unfolding my back like a fern as I went. I'd need some ibuprofen soon. The only way to stop it from worsening was the New Zealand way: go hard and go early on the anti-inflammatories. It was always a dilemma, a stark choice for me: an upset stomach or being crippled for the next few days. I stood still and closed my eyes. The last of the birds settled for the night, and the fox must have gone to look for boiled sweets. Then the silence intensified as if everyone and everything were holding their breath. I missed the initial manifestation. It was the flick of Shadow's head that drew my attention to a movement in the gloom of the corner of the field away from us. I initially thought it was an animal, until it gradually resolved into a tall man's slow rocking gait and exhausted walk. Shadow was up on his fours, tail in the air, and he seemed eager and excited by this approaching stranger, who grew clearer as he came nearer. In the fading light, I could see a tall man stooped over a walking staff wearing a tired flat cap and long overcoat reaching down into the grass. The closer he approached, I could make out that he was of all things, an old tramp. During that brief period from turning to Shadow and then to the tramp, my attention was brought back to the cottage by the fragrance of burning dry gorse hanging in the still evening air. The derelict cottage with its totem of sycamore reaching through the roof had somehow magically impossibly been transformed. I saw a living cottage with 2 small lace-curtained windows, and a tidy blue wooden door with the glowing inner light of an oil lamp in the window nearest to me. Smoke rose from the chimney. Even though I'd become accustomed to the weird and mysterious in Shadow's company, I knew immediately that this was a revisiting of time past. The garden wall was solid and upright once again. The ubiquitous hydrangea from my grandparents' era grew well in each of the 4 corners. But unfortunately I couldn't tell if the flowers were pale blue or pink in the failing light. The stranger came closer, and I saw him raise his free left hand to Shadow as he cracked an exhausted crooked smile from the angular bony face, which I knew had known pitiful kindness and harsh cruelty in unequal measure. He swung a canvas rucksack off his back and settled it on the floor by the wall with the jangle of old army mess tins. The stooped tramp sat down on the reconstituted wall beside Shadow, placed an arm around the cat and pulled him close. 2 good friends were embracing each other affectionately after a long separation. Even though I was standing no more than 10 feet away from the pair and the cottage, I knew I wasn't part of this warm and gentle developing drama. I suspected the tramp couldn't see me from the reality Shadow had conjured up for them both. The tramp wore a long dark green overcoat tied at the waist by a wide leather belt, and I knew that if he took off his cap his hair would be stiff and grey. He wasn't old, but neither was he young. He was in that age band for vagrants where he still retained reasonable health and fitness that would soon desert him. Washi Bark, like many tramps, always knew his passing would be in a workhouse or out in the countryside under a hedge somewhere. This man had lived a hard and harsh life, however. It had occasionally been tempered by the kindnesses of people who recognized his guileless simplicity and fragility. My great-grandparents had fed this very man many a time on his journeys through their little hamlet, and I'd seen him myself as a small child. Yet Shadow somehow knew him. And with a respect and affection that was returned warmly. I knew then that they had both traveled together. The tramp's dark face had cheered up on seeing Shadow, and his massive hand ran gently down Shadow's back and scratched familiarly behind his ears. So it was evidently a meeting of old friends, however unlikely and impossible that was. The tramp Washivark gave Shadow a final jovial pat on his head and groaned softly as he rose to stand, needing just a moment to move again. He picked up his rucksack and walking staff and pushed open the small tidy wooden gate, closing it behind him. Washivark slowly stretched his aching back before taking a few tired steps toward the front door and the lit window. Then removing his flat cap and revealing the roughly cut grey hair I knew was there, he tapped gently on the door holding the cap to his breast and took a step back. Seeing this giant right up against your door might have been frightening for some people. This man's identity was confirmed for me when the doorway to this magical cottage opened. A tiny elderly woman bent nearly in half, shuffled forward, her hand on the doorframe for support. She wore a flowery pinny and a dark woolen scarf over her hair. I could see that she had a round and pretty pink face that some people carry with them into old age. This woman bent her neck painfully to look up at the stranger's face and beamed in sudden delight. "Washi," she cried out, her voice a pleasant tinkle, and extended her free hand to him, which he engulfed diffidently and with such tenderness. "It's you. I've been so worried. You've been away for so long and no one knew where you'd gone." The old lady looked past the giant and saw Shadow standing upright on her wall. "And your little friend's here as well. How wonderful. Come in, both of you. There's stew on the stove. I always make more than I need in case you turn up." Holding one of Washi's hands, the woman shuffled her feet around and turned back into the cottage, her spare hand holding the door frame. "Come in quickly and don't let all the heat escape." Shadow stopped a moment and looked at me before entering. "I'll be in the car," I said. I knew my place. And sadly it wasn't in this unexpected and delightful gathering of old friends. This was a party happening not elsewhere, but elsewhen. Anyway, I had other things to consider. My back, for instance. How I was to get over the wall and back into the car would be an entertainment for anyone passing. I'd be okay once I got there, because I had a small pot of anti-inflammatories in the central pocket and I could overdose. Despite the plan, I stayed there for another 10 minutes, gazing from a respectful distance through the lace-curtained window into the warmly lit cottage, wondering what was in the stew. Washi Bark had removed his coat and I could see him sitting in an armchair by the fire, a golden light shining on his haggard face. The old lady shuffled into sight and offered him a bowl of food. She raised her finger, wagging it in affectionate admonishment. I believe that Washi Bark was rediscovering his smile because of the kindness and memories invested in this small cottage. I was a voyeur. Invisible and out of context in this place of Shadow's manufacture. I accepted this impossible thing, until I remembered it was rude to stare into people's homes. Ever since Shadow invaded my world and brought with him an instability to my reality, ironically I'd become far more stable. For all our adventures, I generally gazed out at the strange new world with a calmness few others would understand. While we might not live on the equator, twilight had faded into darkness quickly and my lower back was chilled. Back to the car for me because that was my only option. Shadow had let me know that he would be some time. He also expected me to be there when he came out again. It was a magical space that we were all inhabiting right then, and it was clearly important for my little feline friend. The world might have been going about its tasks elsewhere, but not here. Here time had not only stopped, but it was also moving backwards. Shadow either knew it would be like this at this particular moment, or he'd created it from a longing and loneliness that he was feeling. He really was a mysterious and complicated little cat. Or, had they made this impossible arrangement to meet here at this time? And, had Shadow forgotten where it was, hence all the driving about for the last week? If that were the case, how long had Shadow been visiting the island? And how many friends did he have here along the island's timeline through history? I took one last look at the warm little cottage and its pleasant front garden, and I was glad for each of the three. I shrugged and hoped everyone in there was forgetting their challenging lives and bathing in each other's affection. The route Washi Bark had taken to come to this place, from across the fields and not along the road, intrigued me. But of course, people are always wary and afraid of strangers. And Washi Bark knew well enough to avoid people as much as he possibly could. So he'd have stuck to the less frequented old routes and footpaths. I wondered whether he'd been aware of the strangeness of their encounter, or maybe he just knew to embrace good fortune and good friends when they happened. In his life, they must have been rare occurrences. I wished I could have been part of their temporary world to discover if the old lady knew my family that had lived nearby. I knew she would. And we could have conversed in clean and uncorrupted Welsh. I was glad for all three people, but felt a degree of self-pity that I could never enter their little world. The car and its discomfort awaited me, and I hoped the heavy waterproof coat was still in the boot because I'd need it before the night was over. I made my delicate way back to the wall and shuffled over it on my bum, protecting my vulnerable lower back. The large yellow moon had risen above the cottage and created a wonderfully idyllic image, the wood smoke rising gently from the chimney to disperse and vanish. I searched my pockets for my mobile phone to take a photograph, waiting for the smoke to gently drift toward the moon before I clicked 2 or 3 photographs. I checked the phone's photo gallery, but it was in vain. I only found dark smudged images of a ruined cottage, the moonlight highlighting a tree growing through the roof. I viewed the lovely cottage with my physical eye. It was a fleeting image of a past that the camera could never capture. By now, I knew enough not to be surprised by anything in this curious new life I was living. The camera existed in objective time and the three friends in a time colored by their warm-hearted memories. I retrieved my coat from the boot, draped it over myself and finally settled in the passenger seat, now Shadow's side. The BBC World Service had always been a fine companion when I couldn't sleep, so I found it on the digital radio, which was probably worth more than the rest of the car and contents, including me. I switched on the engine now and then with the heater full blast to counter the cold, but it did little to alleviate my discomfort. I slept fitfully at best. The last time I'd slept in a car was on a dockside in Portsmouth centuries ago. I enjoyed my simple comforts, didn't feel as if I'd slept a wink and felt sick and cold in the morning. I'm one of those humans who needs his knees to be warm before he can sleep. My knees were cold, and they stayed like that all night. I woke up with a start when a texting teenager drove past at high speed in Daddy's giant tractor, and scared the bejesus out of me. I jumped up in fright and felt something tear in my lower back. The general advice is that you shouldn't take over-the-counter anti-inflammatories after 50, but I didn't care and popped a few more in my mouth. My phone told me it was 5:45 a.m. and dawn was well on the way. I unpeeled myself from the car into the chilly grey morning light and pulled the coat tight around me. I'd somehow made it through the night, and no one had thrown any sheep at me. Instead, a tractor had awoken me, and I was surprised that the racket of the dawn chorus hadn't done it earlier. I was in serious need of coffee, and I needed it right then. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the cottage chimney, and I wondered if the tractor driver had seen anything odd. In the busyness of everyone else's morning, I knew I was the only privileged human out here. What about the hacking fox? What was his experience of all this? He was probably lying on his daybed dreaming of fat chickens. The cottage door opened and a tall figure ducked as he stepped out, bag and walking staff in one hand, his rolled-up cap held respectfully in the other. He turned around and was speaking to the old lady who leaned a hand against the door frame as she stepped out into the morning light. I saw her hand him something in a cloth bag. Undoubtedly something to eat. I knew that some people always gave Washi Bark a few pennies for his pocket, and if the stories from Holyhead were true, he'd save these up for the occasional pint in one of the town pubs. Why shouldn't he? He'd probably paid his dues serving his country and suffered terribly for it. Washi saluted her with a smile and his forefinger to his forelock. The old lady reached up a hand and touched his arm kindly, probably admonishing him for keeping away so long. The old lady also smiled as she wagged a finger toward the ground. That would be Shadow down there. Did they speak to each other, I wondered? But of course, anything might be possible in the universe in which they were existing. I went around to the driver's side and watched them as they waved farewell to each other. Washi Bark adjusted his cap and swung his rucksack over his shoulder, as he talked to the cat who was lost below him among the grasses, only his tail giving him away. I decided it was best I stayed out of sight before they arrived. I threw my coat in the back, and when I looked up again, I was saddened to see that the cottage was once again a ruin. It meant that the old lady had been lying in her invisible and uncared for grave for many decades. Washi Bark and Shadow were still walking across the field and objective time seemed to be reasserting its authority as they came closer. I ducked into the driver's seat and slumped as low as I could. Washi Bark reached down, picked up Shadow and placed him on the wall before following and climbing over himself. Neither looked back across the field. They were both in their small temporal bubble, moving safely through our time and would be undisturbed by our world. In the improving light, Washi Bark's face was still gaunt and angular and his poor health was more evident in the low and cold early morning light. However, he was smiling an engaging crooked smile as he talked to Shadow who was also attending to his friend. It was beyond me, and I chose to accept it for what it was, a pleasant distraction for the tramp and the cat in their complicated individual lives. He was the same man who'd walked past our council house and up to Velengreig farm half a century ago and had both frightened and intrigued me as a small child. Washi Bark seemed younger than the giant I remembered lumbering up past our house to the farm to an assured welcome. My parents had told me that Mr. and Mrs. Williams would offer him a meal and a place to sleep in the barn in exchange for his matches and bacco. I was suddenly emotional and tearful. I just realized that in Shadow's mobile time bubble, both my parents were alive and probably in robust health in their late 30s. I hadn't been born yet. Mam would still be singing in concerts, and Dad a part-time volunteer on the fire brigade or by then a full-time ambulance driver. Neither would have been the frail and ill people I'd last seen. If I were in their bubble, I might have gone home for Mom's breakfast and Dad's joyful laughter again. Instead, I admit I wept desperately painful tears of sorrow. Bloody hell. I'd become so vulnerable. I looked up through my tears, and saw Washi Bark pause for a moment and stare at me with those deep-set eyes. He said something to Shadow, and then the tramp turned and smiled down at the cat, as if he had said something witty to draw him away from the anomaly. He brought his hand swiftly to his mouth and coughed painfully before recovering and wiping his eyes with the back of his large hand. They both moved on, safe in their own time and warm companionship. A roaring sound drew my attention forward as another bloody tractor rushed toward us. I swung around and looked out the back window, concerned for the two friends. But they were gone. Companions in a bubble moving through our messed up world. And Washi Bark must have been unaware of the protection bestowed on him by his little friend. I sat back and wondered whether I was only in my timeline with respect to Shadow. And maybe that timeline was outside of yours.